Hello, folks. My name's Dave Kidd. This is the I Am podcast, Internal Art Museum, where I take images that I use in my counseling and bring them to you folks. So today, we're going to be talking about grief. It's going to be a little bit heavier today. What I want you to imagine, the picture today, I want you to imagine your grief like a storm. So imagine grief like a storm. All right, so as usual, my daughter Lily has done a wonderful picture of grief like a storm. So you see poor sad little me in a rowboat and this storm raging all around me. And we're going to talk a little bit about how grief is just like that, how grief shares a lot of attributes of a storm. So loss, obviously associated with grief. We're going to explore a little bit about that association today. Loss is a type of emotional injury. A loss injury requires healing through accepting a new reality, and we're going to unpack that. So there's lots of different kinds of losses. You can lose a loved one, and you can lose a relationship. You can lose a pet. You can lose a job. All of these have elements of loss, and all of them are experiences relevant to some of the ideas we're going to be exploring today. Now, just to define some terms, grieving is what we're going to call the healing that happens from loss. So loss is what you experience. It's the thing that happens to you. Loss is the thing that happens to you, and grieving is how you heal from that loss injury. I believe it's useful to look at this grieving process like a storm. The healing process is the storm. So we're going to get into all the nuts and bolts of this, but I thought that I would start off by sharing something personally. So I've had my own grief experiences, significant ones in life. I, in 2002, had twins that were born prematurely. They were born healthy, even though they were very premature. They were born healthy into the neonatal intensive care unit, but fairly shortly after they were born, they acquired hospital-borne illnesses. And both of them died fairly shortly after. My daughter Madeline lived for about a week, and my son Max lived for about a month and a half. And this is back in 2002, so we're talking 23 years ago now. So that was obviously very challenging for myself and my wife. These were our first children, and would have been the first grandchildren in our family. So there was a lot of anticipation and a lot of heartbreak and pain when we lost them. So I'd been a few years into my practice by then, and part of my practice was talking to clients who were dealing with grief. So I used my training and tried my best to help, and did so with the best of intentions, and I felt competent in my practice. But when I experienced the death of my first two kids, I really felt suddenly that I became a member in this horrible club, this grief club, after I recovered to the extent that I was able to practice again, because I took a little bit of time off, not a lot of time. But when I started practicing again, I felt a confidence in dealing with grief that I hadn't before, just based on my own personal experiences. Now, this is 23 years ago, and so some of the memories have faded, but I'm going to talk a little bit about how the fundamentals of the grief experience fit with my own experience. Now, I also want to say that I've recently had a grief experience. My older brother, Ian, passed away only about a month ago, so it's still very fresh. And I'm prepared to talk a little bit about that as well. It's been a difficult month. Ian and I were close as kids, and in our adult lives, we would see each other, once every month or two. I guess he lived quite a ways away, and so we didn't have as much contact as adults, and I definitely have regrets about that, and I think that contributes to my own grief experience too. But what complicates things is Ian had an intellectual disability. So I had this strange role. And I should say too that I've debated whether or not I wanted to talk about this, because I didn't want it to be exploitative. I wanted it to be genuine and authentic and useful, and I wouldn't be sharing it unless I thought it was useful. But I did think perhaps there might be something to be gained from hearing about my personal experience. And so that's why I've chosen to share it. So Ian was born with intellectual disability, and he had quite serious epilepsy as well. He almost died a number of times when he was a young kid. And that, I know, shaped me. As a 5-year-old, we shared a bedroom, and I think we had bunk beds. He had the lower bunk, and so sometimes he would have seizures at night because they hadn't found medication that would deal with his seizures effectively. So it was my job in the middle of the night when he had a seizure to go and wake up my parents. So as a 5-year-old, that's a lot, right? And clearly stress had built up. I think I developed an ulcer, I think is what I'd been told by my parents. And what it set me up for is a real sensitivity, I think, to the needs of others. From a time I was really young, I was hyper-focused on Ian's vulnerabilities and on the need to take care of him. So I'm sure that has shaped me as an adult as well, and probably pushed me into the field that I chose. So, and I'll be honest too, I think as an adult, buried deep in me was this memory of the anxiety and the stress associated with caring for Ian. And I think that maybe caused me to distance myself a little bit as an adult for me, and because I was wary of being overwhelmed by all of that. Even though Ian was quite high functioning, lived in a semi-independent living setting, and didn't need a lot of support day to day, I still felt like I could have been more involved as an adult, but there was something getting in the way of that. And I think it was probably this early experience of being immersed in a very high stakes, stressful environment on a daily basis for a long time. So Ian had been in poor health for the last couple of years, but when he did die, it was quite sudden. And that was a new experience for me, because the experience with my twins was different. It was less unexpected, I think, and less shocking. With the twins, the grief, I think, was more for the future, what they would miss and what I would miss in not having them around to, experience all the fun parenting stuff with. Whereas with Ian, I've got a lifetime of memories. And so the loss is saturated with all of those memories. And so we're a month out now, and already I feel different than I did a month ago, but it's been difficult. And so I just wanted to sort of lay that out for you And as I move through some of these ideas associated with grief, I'll punctuate them with my own experiences so that I can kind of give you a sense of how they apply in real life. So looking at grief like a storm, why is that an appropriate analogy? Well, I think it's because storms are natural. Storms always come and they always go. And they challenge us, so we have the opportunity to emerge from them changed, stronger, wiser, and better versions of ourselves. But the grief storm isn't like a regular storm in certain ways. The primary way in which it's not like a regular storm is it doesn't blow away on its own. There are calm waters on the other side, but we have to move through it to get to those calm waters. And as I've moved through this most recent experience, I'm in the middle of that storm, and there's a long way to go still. But I think the new insight that I've gained from this particular difficult experience is that the healing takes place as we get used to this new reality. It's painful to get used to the fact that Ian is lost to me, that he's not in the world anymore. So this storm is me coming to terms with that and eventually getting used to that new reality. And you can imagine the more surprising and unwanted that reality is, the bigger and more intense the storm is. So somebody who loses their iPhone, it's going to be distressing and upsetting, but they're going to deal with that. Somebody who loses a spouse or loses their 14-year-old, their grief storm is going to be significantly larger and longer because of how much more was at stake in that loss. I think it's important to also understand that every grief storm is unique and every grief storm is similar. You know, in each grief storm, something has been lost. And your job moving through that storm is to get used to that loss, is to understand that loss. So there's a commonality there. But even in my two grief experiences, you can see how there's a lot of difference in each grief storm. So it's important to not assume that you know exactly what it's like for somebody who's experienced a loss, because it's probably going to be a little bit different than yours. That's what I've noted through my practice. So there are more images attached to grief that we'll be exploring in the future, but I just wanted to lay a bit of a foundation today. Grief is a really complex experience, and so one podcast isn't going to do it justice, but I just wanted to provide an introduction and a bit of a foundation, as I say. So as I'm working with clients, I find that there are two principles that need to be present in order to move through this grief storm in a healthy way. And that's acknowledging the loss and getting the inside stuff out. I believe if you're doing those two things, you're going to move through that grief storm and keep your forward momentum. You know, I said earlier that storms are natural, and that's something that's really key, I think, to understanding grief, is it's not abnormal. It's not something weird that shouldn't happen. It is part of life, and it's horrible when it does happen, and I wish it didn't happen to anybody. But it is a natural part of life. And understanding that provides some kind of comfort, reduces a little bit of the fear, I think, understanding that it is natural. So under acknowledging the loss, I'm not the first one, obviously, to realize this, but ritual and ceremony seems really important. Cultures throughout the world have developed their own rituals around death. And I think I've seen recently sort of a concerning trend in Western culture away from death ceremony and death ritual, perhaps to try to reduce the pain. But it's clear to me that these ceremonies and rituals are there for a reason. We've kept them in our cultures throughout the world, I think, because they force us to confront something that we wouldn't otherwise be brave enough to confront. We don't want to look face to face at the pain in our lives associated with loss. So at my brother's funeral, there was an open casket. And so I had to look at my dead brother. And I couldn't avoid the reality that he was no longer with us. And there was this really strong juxtaposition between Ian lying there in his coffin and the pictures of Ian throughout his life that were being displayed in a slideshow. So up on this huge screen were all of these pictures from his, 50 odd years of life. And he was very much alive, having fun, playing sports, doing all the activities he liked to do. Yet here he was with no life in him, lying in front of me. And that was really powerful and really painful. But I think it's also important and helpful to acknowledge that reality. But it doesn't all just get out of our system. We don't just kind of flip the switch at a funeral and come to terms with the loss all at once. It seems as though it's more about 1,000 little losses that move us through that storm. 1,000 times during the day, you'll come across situations where the absence of that person is thrown in your face. If you live in the same city as that person you've lost, you'll drive by their favorite restaurant. You'll see a car that they used to drive. You'll pass the gym where they went. And every time you're faced with the reality that they're no longer living. And there's pain in each one of those moments. But in each one of those moments, it further solidifies this new reality that we're trying to get used to. So it's important to acknowledge the loss, but I also think it's really important to go easy on yourself, especially early on, and especially if it's a huge, catastrophic loss. There's probably going to be a time early in the process where it's just too painful to acknowledge. Things seem unreal, and I think it's okay at the beginning to accept that barrier you put up between yourself and the truth. Because just letting it flood in all at once would be probably devastating. So at the beginning, when you're in the most fierce part of this storm, I think it's understandable to block out that reality. It might not be the case for everybody, but if it is for you, I think you should go easy on yourself and you should give yourself a little bit of time and accept that this is just how it is. And then as you continue working through that storm, you'll find there comes a day when that reality starts to seep in. And at that point, you can accept it, start to accept it anyway. So another way to acknowledge that loss is to actively decide to take out the grief and look at it, which means when appropriate, when you're ready, to spend time thinking about the person and just see what happens. You don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen. I do this as I think about my brother. I did this as I thought about my twins. And you don't know if powerful emotions are going to come up. You don't know which emotions are going to come up. Perhaps nothing will come up, and it won't be a difficult moment for you. But giving yourself the opportunity to process and reflect, I think, is healthy, even though it's painful. Then the second part, getting the inside stuff out. This is really important too. Lots of feelings are bubbling away, and sometimes it feels as though you could almost be destroyed by these feelings. They're so powerful. Getting those feelings out somehow, I think, is crucial. because they can kind of eat you alive if you don't. There's no wrong way to feel. If you want to laugh, laugh. If you want to cry, cry. But accepting how you're feeling, acknowledging how you're feeling, I think is really important. Again, early on, the emotions seem so powerful that if you feel they're just too overwhelming, you can protect yourself and put up that wall for a while. But know that there will come a time when you have to acknowledge those feelings. So instead of having to just be at the beck and call of these emotions, you can try to dose those emotions. There are images attached to this as well, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But for now, you can think about saying, okay, for the next half hour, I'm going to just allow those emotions to wash over and just let come what comes. And then I'm going to throw myself into my work for a little while, or go out for a walk or something, and get back into the present. And then 3 hours from now, 6 hours from now, maybe I'll take another little time, or maybe you just take one time a day, whatever you think you can do. But thinking about it in terms of dosing can be helpful. That said, also understand that, especially early on in the process, you may not have a lot of control over your emotions. I've definitely found this in my experiences. My younger brother got married shortly after the twins died. And during my mother's speech at the wedding, she referred to the fact that my brother flew back from overseas to be there to hold my daughter after she died. And I lost it and couldn't get it back together. And so I ended up having to leave and walk around for a long time. And there was nothing I could do to get those emotions under control. I just had to wait and let them pass through. And that's okay, especially at the beginning. There will probably be times when you're overcome and sideswiped by these emotions. And giving yourself grace when that happens is important. You can also expect that. So early on in the process, as you're going through the most intense time of that storm, planning for the likelihood that you're going to be sideswiped can also be useful too. So you don't put yourself somewhere where you absolutely know it'll be really embarrassing if the emotions bubble up. Something to think about too. Yeah, so getting the inside stuff out, you can talk about how you're feeling. You can express the emotions by yourself or with others. Expressing them means getting them out, right? So expressing the emotions, whatever they are. Listening to music also provokes emotional responses sometimes, and it can be a good way of getting in touch with those emotions. If you play music, playing music can help you get those emotions out, as well as other types of artistic expression. All of those are ways to help you get the inside stuff out. And it's also important here to pay attention to your body and any changes that are going on, whether it's in your body or your behavior or your thoughts. I find a weird thing with me, I've noticed this over the last month, is sometimes I don't even know that I'm upset. I'm not thinking about my brother Ian, but I feel off and I feel rotten. And it's only been after a while that I've realized that I trace it back to that loss somehow. And I'll be honest, I don't know exactly what to do about it other than accept it and communicate to those around me that I might be having an off day today. So I apologize if I'm a little bit shorter or more irritable than usual. But sometimes it comes out in ways that you don't expect it. So even though you're not thinking about the person, if you're feeling rotten, it might trace back to the grief experience itself. So some things to expect about the grief experience. Again, not every grief experience is the same, but it's helpful to set expectations for the grief experience, because if you've never had any sort of experience with it, it can be very, very unsettling and challenging and devastating and scary. So I think intuitively, we just assume that feeling horrible means something wrong is happening. But I believe feeling horrible is a healthy response to something horrible happening. A main part of my job as a therapist is just to convince people or reassure people that they're not losing their minds when they come and talk to me and they're right in the middle of a grief experience. It can be so disorienting and so excruciatingly painful that they assume this can't be right. And just providing reassurances that this is normal can be helpful and can help people to settle a little bit. Doesn't take the pain away, but it takes the extra fear attached to it away sometimes. So it's not wrong to feel horrible. It's actually natural. And anxiety can also be a major component associated with grief. When something horrible and unexpected happens, our immediate thought is, well, this wasn't supposed to happen, right? So if we lose a child, people are supposed to live until they're 85 and die in their sleep, right? That's what we just assume our whole lives until we experience it ourselves, until we are touched by the death of someone. And so that shatters this delusion that we had. And all of a sudden we think, well, if this thing that wasn't supposed to happen happened, what's to prevent other horrible things from happening as well? And all of the fragility of life just rushes in, and we can feel really scared and fragile and vulnerable as a result. So expect that. It may not happen. It may be stronger for some people than others, but it's a possibility. And learning to be mindful and stay in the present can help with that anxiety in those moments. There can be unreal feelings where you and the world just doesn't seem right. Something just seems off, and oftentimes you can't even put your finger on what it is, but things just feel off. It's felt like that a number of times over the last month for me. There's just this kind of emotional grayness, and it's really hard to nail it down. That can come in the experience as well. I talked about getting sideswiped. Very annoying and disconcerting, but often common as well. So expect that to happen. Low motivation, depending on the severity of the loss, you can feel extreme sadness. But this isn't a major depressive disorder. This is a natural response to something that has happened. And as you do the work and move through that grief storm, those feelings will lift as well. So just a few ideas, and this is in no way exhaustive, but just a few ideas to think about. During the most difficult times of the storm, it's good to really shorten your horizon and look at your next step, the next minute, the next hour, the next day, instead of how am I going to get through the rest of my life without this person. You can deal with the next hour, and that makes things a little bit less overwhelming. The whole idea of mindfulness and staying in the present can be really helpful. Accepting the fact that you don't have as much control as you would like. I like to be in control of my emotions, and I'm just not as in control of them when I'm in the middle of that grief storm. And there's only so much I can do about that. I have to accept it. And then just finally, this idea of feeling what you feel. You don't know what emotions are going to come. You don't know if emotions are going to come. As we moved through the last month, my family members and I experienced different feelings at different times. We were all present in various moments. Some felt powerful emotions, some didn't. And there were different emotions experienced amongst all of us during the same moment. And so it's really hard to understand why that's the case, but to accept the fact that we can't control what we feel and just to allow ourselves to feel what we feel, I think is also important. So this was obviously a heavier episode today. Again, by no means exhaustive. And if you're in the middle of that grief storm, I really encourage you to seek out the help of a counseling professional, because I think it can be really useful just to get you on that path through the storm and set your expectations right. Storms will always come and they'll always go. And there's a lot of hope in that, knowing that the storm will eventually pass if you do the work of moving through it. All right, well, that was pretty heavy today, but thanks for sticking with me, and I hope you found that useful. We'll see you in our next episode. Take care, y'all.